The chance of living through a real disaster in the air is very small, but for some people, that tiny risk became real. And when it did, the cameras were already rolling. On most flights, if something goes wrong, the world never sees it. Once in a while, a security camera, a dashcam, or a tourist with a camera captures those last seconds that end up on the evening news. In this documentary, we go back to real plane disasters that were caught on camera and slow them down. We look past the shock of the footage and explain what the crews were dealing with and what investigators found afterward. You can support the channel by subscribing and liking the video. It helps a lot and keeps these in-depth documentaries coming. On the afternoon of October 17, 2019, a PenAir commuter flight left Anchorage, Alaska, in the United States, bound for one of the most challenging destinations in the Aleutian Islands, Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island. The airplane was a Saab 2000, a fast, slim turboprop designed to get in and out of short runways. On board were 42 people, many of them local residents and workers heading home at the end of the day. Unalaska Airport sits in a tight valley between steep hills and the cold water of the Bering Sea. Runway 13 starts near the town and ends just before a rock embankment and the harbor. There is no long safety zone at the far end. When pilots land from the front door direction toward runway 13, they often accept a tailwind. That keeps the approach simpler, but it also means the airplane touches down with a higher speed over the ground and has less room to stop. As the flight headed southwest, the crew listened to weather reports from Dutch Harbor. The wind slowly shifted around to blow more and more from behind the runway. Company rules and the aircraft manual both said that any tailwind above 15 knots was not allowed for landing. When the Saab neared Unalaska, the captain still chose the front door approach. On the first attempt, the approach did not look stable. The speed and descent were not where they should be, and the first officer called for a go-around. The captain agreed, added power, and climbed away into the clouds. After the go-around, they talked about what to do next. The safest choice would have been to change direction and try to land on the opposite runway, or to divert to another airport. Instead, under time pressure and with fuel slowly going down, they decided to try runway 13 again. They asked for another wind check. The answer was now clearly bad news. Strong winds from a direction that meant a big tailwind on their chosen runway. On the cockpit recording, both pilots reacted, and they knew this was beyond normal limits. Yet they pressed on, telling each other that this would be their last attempt. On the second approach, the Saab crossed the shoreline and lined up with the runway. To keep a safe airspeed in the tailwind, its speed across the ground was much higher than usual. The airplane floated down the runway and finally touched down well beyond the ideal point, still doing roughly the speed of a small jet. On a long runway, that would have left extra distance. At Unalaska, it did not. At first, the landing felt normal. The first officer pulled the power levers into reverse, and the captain pressed firmly on the brake pedals. The thrust reversers opened, and the airplane began to slow. Then the deceleration faded. The captain pushed harder on the brakes. The first officer called out that the brakes were not giving them what they needed. The captain said he already had full pressure on the pedals, but the runway end was rushing toward them. The reason sat hidden inside the landing gear. Years earlier, during an overhaul at a maintenance shop, two small wires for the wheel speed sensors on the left main landing gear had been connected to the wrong wheels. The brake control system used those sensors to decide when to protect a wheel from skidding by reducing brake pressure. With the wires crossed, the system now believed that a different wheel was slipping. When one of the real wheels on the left side began to skid on the wet surface and its tire started to fail, the brake system eased off pressure on the other wheels instead. In effect, just when they needed maximum braking, 3 of the 4 main wheels were not doing their share. From the cockpit, it simply felt as if the brakes had almost disappeared. The Saab rolled through the last part of the runway, onto the short paved overrun, and straight toward the airport fence. The captain tried to angle slightly to the right to avoid going straight into the water. The airplane smashed through a chain-link fence, crossed a ditch and a road, and then hit the rock embankment that separates the shoreline from the harbor. When the left landing gear collapsed on the rocks, the spinning left propeller struck solid stone. The blades tore loose in an instant. One blade flew outward into the water. Others were driven through the side of the fuselage. Inside the cabin, passengers near the 4th row saw metal erupt through the wall. One person was fatally injured. Another blade ended up lodged upright in the floor near the 5th row, stuck between the floor and ceiling like a piece of wreckage from a movie set, but only a few centimeters from other passengers' legs. The airplane came to rest with its nose pointing slightly down toward the water and its tail still on the rocks. In the cockpit, the crew silenced warnings, shut down the engines, and ordered an evacuation. Flight attendants opened doors and directed people out onto the rocks. Some passengers climbed down onto the breakwater in shock, helped each other away from the aircraft, and waited as local emergency crews arrived. One passenger later died from injuries. Several others were seriously hurt, but many walked away. Accident investigators later tied the crash to 3 main factors. First, the landing gear had been incorrectly wired during heavy maintenance, and that error was never caught by inspections or tests. Second, Second, the airport's short runway and limited overrun left little margin once braking performance was reduced. And third, the crew chose to land with a tailwind that was above the recommended limit, even after one unstable approach, and even after hearing a wind report that clearly signaled extra risk. The morning of TransAsia Airways Flight 235 did not feel like the start of a major disaster. It was a short domestic hop from Taipei Songshan Airport to Kinmen, a small island near the Chinese coast. The aircraft was an ATR-72, with 58 people on board and clear winter weather over the city. It was a route the crew had flown many times. Just after 10:50 in the morning, the aircraft lined up on runway 10 at Songshan, pushed its power levers forward, and began its takeoff roll. Passengers felt the familiar vibration of the turboprop engines and the quick acceleration of a regional takeoff. The runway sits right in the middle of Taipei. Beyond the airport fence are highways, apartment blocks, and the Keeling River. There is almost no open space if anything goes wrong. Liftoff felt normal. The ATR climbed away from the runway, gear coming up, flaps beginning their retraction. But in the cockpit, the first signs of trouble appeared within seconds. An intermittent fault in the automatic power and propeller system on the right engine triggered an uncommanded autofeather. In simple terms, the right engine stopped producing useful thrust, even though its propeller was still windmilling. The airplane began to yaw and roll because the left engine was now pushing, while the right side was mostly drag. At this stage, a clear, methodical engine failure drill would have kept the situation under control. Instead, confusion and misidentification took over. The crew received warnings and indications suggesting a problem on the right side, but the pilot flying pulled back the power on the left engine, the only one still producing full thrust. Within a short time, that engine was actually shut down. The ATR was now climbing low over a dense city with both engines effectively lost, one because of a fault, the other because the crew had mistakenly cut it off. A stick shaker and other stall warnings began to sound as the speed bled away. The airplane's nose was still relatively high while the power available had collapsed. The turboprop entered a stall, no longer generating enough lift to stay flying. Instead of a smooth climb, the aircraft started to sink and roll. Below, drivers on an elevated highway were going about a normal day. Some of their cars had dash cameras recording the traffic. Those cameras suddenly captured something no one ever expects to see. The ATR came into view crossing the road at a steep left bank, wings nearly vertical, dropping toward the Keeling River. For a moment it hung there in the frame, a large plane sideways over a highway lined with cars and buses. Then the left wing hit. The wingtip and outer section sliced into a taxi and the edge of the bridge, tearing off metal and sending the vehicle spinning. The impact ripped part of the wing away and twisted the airplane even further. An instant later, the crippled turboprop rolled into the river beside the road, hitting the water inverted and breaking apart. The dashcam views end with a spray of water, flying debris, and the sudden loss of the airplane from the frame. In the cabin, there had been only seconds between a normal climb and the final impact. Passengers would have felt the unusual roll, heard stall warnings and engine noises change, and seen the city tilt outside their windows. Some were thrown from their seats as the airplane rolled and then hit the bridge and water. Inside, structures broke, seats tore loose, and water rushed into the fuselage. Rescue crews arrived quickly. The ATR had come down in a shallow section of the river, close to the bank and not far from the airport. Helicopters hovered above. Inflatable boats and divers moved around the partly submerged wreckage. Firefighters and soldiers worked from the bridge and riverbank, pulling survivors out through torn sections of the fuselage and bringing them ashore on stretchers and rafts. Images of a child being lifted from the wreckage and people standing on the overturned wing went around the world within hours. In total, 43 of the 58 people on board died. 15 survived with varying degrees of injury. On the ground, the taxi driver and passenger in the car that had been hit by the wing were injured but lived. The investigation that followed focused first on the engines and propeller systems, then on the crew's actions. Data from the flight recorders confirmed the sequence that the videos had only hinted at. A fault in the automatic system caused the right engine propeller to feather and stop producing thrust. Instead of carefully identifying the failed engine and keeping power on the good one, the pilots reduced power on the left engine and then shut it down completely. With the airplane low, heavy, and now essentially without thrust, the stall warnings were accurate. The turboprop was flying too slowly at too high an angle of attack. Control inputs from the pilot flying were often opposite to what the situation required. The stick pusher, designed to lower the nose and break the stall, was pulled against. The ATR rolled left more and more as the speed decayed. Investigators also looked at the wider context. Training records, checking standards, and previous issues at the airline showed a pattern of weak engine failure handling and inconsistent simulator practice. In response, authorities in Taiwan ordered major changes in training for turboprop crews, stricter proficiency checks, and new emphasis on basic stall recognition and recovery. The airline eventually ceased operations. On the evening of December 20th, 2016, a Boeing 727 cargo jet lined up for departure at Germán Olano Airport in Puerto Carreño, a small town in eastern Colombia near the border with Venezuela. The flight was headed for Bogotá with 6 people on board, 5 crew members and 1 extra person riding along. The runway at Puerto Carreño is short, about 1,800 meters, set in flat land with a road and a perimeter fence right off the end. The 727 began its takeoff roll on runway 25. Flaps were set, power came up, and the old freighter started to accelerate. But from the very first seconds, it was fighting the numbers. The investigation later found that the airplane was probably above its maximum takeoff weight. The crew had chosen speeds that were higher than they needed, and there was a small tailwind on the runway. All of that meant the jet would need more distance than usual to lift off. As it roared toward the far end, it used every meter of pavement and still was not airborne. What happened next was caught by people standing on the public road that crosses the airport's far end. On video, the 727 bursts into view at low height, racing past the edge of the runway. It tears through the perimeter fence, sending debris flying. Motorcyclists and pedestrians on the road duck and swerve as the right wing misses them by only a few meters. The airplane clips a small building, then a tree, before it finally drags itself into the air, trailing pieces of metal. That brief impact sequence rips off the right main landing gear, damages the inboard right flap, knocks out thrust on the right outboard engine, and punctures a hydraulic system. Now the 727 is airborne, but in terrible shape. Inside the cockpit, the crew feel a heavy yaw and drag on the right side, and see that one engine is dying and hydraulic pressure is falling. With the landing gear gone on one side and the wing damaged, they have to hold strong left rudder and a careful bank just to keep the airplane level. The jet climbs to only about 800 feet above the ground and begins a shallow right turn. On radar and on the ground, witnesses see it tracing a slow, uneven arc away from the airport. The damaged systems leave the crew with very few tools. The main hydraulic systems have been cut, and the standby system is never activated. Control field becomes heavy and unreliable. Airspeed starts to bleed away. As the right bank slowly increases, the lift on the wings is no longer enough to hold the airplane up. About 4 nautical miles from the airport, the plane descends into flat terrain and explodes in a large fireball. 5 of the 6 people on board are killed. 1 crew member survives with serious injuries. Investigators later concluded that Flight 157 should never have been in that position. The crew did not correctly perform their takeoff performance planning. They used a rotation speed that was about 5 knots higher than necessary, rotated too slowly, and chose a runway with a tailwind at an airport that was not even approved for that type of airplane. Overloading, tailwind, and technique together meant the 727 could not lift off within the available runway. Once it hit the fence, the road, the shed, and the tree, the damage to the landing gear, flap, engine, and hydraulics made the short climb that followed almost impossible to survive. On video, the story of Aerosucre Flight 157 looks like a cargo jet that simply takes off too late and crashes in the distance. The investigation shows a deeper pattern: poor oversight, weak performance discipline, and a crew trying to make an overloaded freighter do something the runway, the wind, and the laws of physics would not allow. On December 29, 2012, a Red Wings Airlines Tupolev plane was flying a repositioning leg from the Czech Republic to Moscow-Vnukovo Airport in Russia. There were no passengers on board, only 8 crew members bringing the jet home after a charter. Snow had fallen around Moscow, the temperature was below freezing, and there was a gusty crosswind over the airfield. For the crew, it was supposed to be a routine arrival at their home base. The approach itself looked normal. The jet crossed the threshold at a reasonable height and touched down about 1/3 of the way along the runway, at roughly 230 kilometers per hour. In the cockpit, the crew did what they always did. They lowered the nose, selected reverse thrust, and applied the brakes. But on this airplane, full braking and reverse depend on signals that the main landing gear are firmly on the ground. Those weight on wheels signals come from the gear legs. With the crosswind from the right, the left gear compressed more than the right, and because key parts in the reverse control system had been misadjusted, the logic never fully saw a proper touchdown. So although the levers in the cockpit were set to reverse, the engines did not actually produce full reverse thrust, and the spoilers and air brakes on the wings did not deploy when they should have. From the cabin and from the outside, it simply looked like a jet rolling down a snowy runway and not slowing the way it should. After more than 30 seconds, the airplane was still moving at over 200 kilometers per hour. Only late in the roll did the captain call for emergency engine shutdown, but by then the jet was already nearing the end of the pavement. Beyond the end of runway 19, there was no long safety area, only a slope, a ditch, the perimeter fence, and then the busy Kievskoye highway. The Tu-204 slid off the end, went down the embankment, smashed through the fence, and broke apart on the edge of the highway. A dashboard camera in a passing car recorded the moment the airplane burst into view, disintegrated, and scattered wreckage and fuel across the road. The forward fuselage and cockpit were torn off. Wheels and structural pieces struck a car, injuring the driver. Rescue crews reached the scene quickly, but the front of the airplane had taken enormous forces. The captain, first officer, and flight engineer died in the wrecked cockpit section. 2 flight attendants were also killed. 3 other cabin crew members survived with serious injuries. In total, 5 of the 8 crew died. There were no passengers on board, and 1 person on the ground was injured. The investigation later linked this crash to a similar overrun just 9 days earlier, when another Tu-204 from the same airline went off the runway at Novosibirsk with braking problems, but no fatalities. Inspectors found that on the Vnukovo airplane, actuators and limit switches in the thrust reverse control system were incorrectly adjusted, preventing proper deployment of reverse and spoilers. The crew, trusting that the system was working, did not immediately realize that the airplane was not decelerating normally and did not initiate a go-around or maximum manual braking early in the rollout. To most people, Red Wing's flight is a shocking dashcam clip of a Russian jet exploding onto a highway. The full story is a mix of winter weather, a misadjusted braking and reverse system, and a crew who did everything by habit on landing, without knowing that the airplane's hardware had silently taken away the stopping power they thought they had. On May 5, 2019, Aeroflot Flight 1492 took off from Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow, Russia, on a short flight to Murmansk in the north of the country. The airplane was a Sukhoi Superjet, with 78 people on board. A few minutes after takeoff, the airplane flew into a storm cell and was struck by lightning. The autopilot disconnected, and parts of the electrical system failed. The flight control computers switched into a basic backup mode, where the jet responded more sharply and offered fewer protections. Radio problems followed. The crew eventually managed to call the tower on a backup frequency and requested an immediate return to Sheremetyevo. Controllers vectored the Superjet back toward the airport. Because they could not dump fuel, the airplane was well above its normal landing weight. That is allowed in an emergency, but it demands a careful, stable approach. On final to runway 24 left, the weather was gusty with a crosswind. In the cockpit, checklists and briefings were incomplete. Several times, an automated voice warned of possible wind shear and called for a go-around. The crew continued the approach. Over the runway threshold, the Superjet was still fast, about 15 knots above the target speed. Passing down the runway, the captain pulled the thrust levers to idle and tried to flare. In the sensitive backup mode, his sidestick inputs produced a firm, flat touchdown on all 3 landing gear at once. The airplane bounced back into the air. The captain then moved the controls back and forth, trying to catch the pitch. The jet porpoised, hitting the runway again even harder. On the 3rd impact, the force drove the main gear up into the wing, rupturing fuel tanks and structure. Fuel poured out and ignited. Ground cameras and passenger videos show the Superjet sliding down the runway, trailing a sheet of fire. The rear fuselage quickly swallowed in flames and thick black smoke. The jet veered toward the side of the runway and came to a stop, still burning from the back half of the cabin. In the cockpit, the crew shut down what systems they could and ordered an evacuation. The forward doors were opened and slides deployed. Video from the runway shows passengers coming down the slides with a wall of fire behind them. Some are carrying hand luggage, which slows the flow at the exits. For people seated toward the rear, heat and smoke arrive too quickly. Many never reach the doors. In the end, 41 of the 78 people on board die, most of them in the back of the cabin. 37 survive. Investigators found that the lightning strike and electrical failure created a serious, stressful situation, but did not make the airplane uncontrollable. The key problems came later: an incomplete approach briefing, the decision to continue despite wind shear warnings, an unstable fast approach, and large, poorly coordinated control inputs during the flare and bounce sequence that destroyed the landing gear and started the fire. The report also pointed to gaps in training for this degraded flight mode and to the danger caused when passengers try to take bags with them during an evacuation. For most people, Aeroflot Flight is a short, shocking clip of a burning jet racing down a runway in Moscow. Behind those few seconds of video is a longer story about lightning, system failures, human stress, and the narrow margin for error when a heavy airplane comes back to land in bad weather. On March 7, 2007, Garuda Indonesia Flight 200 left Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, for the city of Yogyakarta on the island of Java. The airplane was a Boeing 737 with 140 people on board. It was an early morning domestic flight, full of commuters, families, and a group of Australian journalists covering an official visit. As the jet approached Addis Egypto International Airport, the crew prepared to land on runway 09er, a relatively short strip with a road and rice fields beyond the far end. For a safe arrival, they needed a stable approach, a gentle descent, the correct flap setting, and a normal landing speed. Instead, the Boeing came down the slope too steep and far too fast. Flight data later showed that it crossed the runway threshold at about twice the normal height and close to 100 knots above a typical landing speed for this airplane. In the cockpit, the warning signs were clear. The ground proximity warning system began to call out sink rate and then pull up as the descent became too steep. The first officer, sitting in the right seat, repeatedly told the captain that they were too fast and urged him to go around and try again. On the recorder, he even shouts, "Go around, Captain." But the captain was fixated on getting the airplane down on this first attempt. He pressed on, trying to salvage the landing instead of abandoning it. The configuration was also wrong. For a landing at normal speed, the flaps, panels on the back of the wing that increase lift and drag, should have been extended to a high setting. The plan was to use 40 degrees of flaps. Instead, the first officer, worried about the very high speed, only selected 5 degrees, which is more appropriate at much higher speeds. He never clearly told the captain what he had done. With so little flap, the airplane had even less drag and needed an even longer runway to stop. The Boeing finally touched down about 860 meters beyond the threshold, already well past the normal touchdown zone, still doing more than 200 knots across the ground. It bounced, hit the runway again, and then kept rolling. The thrust reversers were briefly deployed and then stowed again while the airplane was still moving quickly. There simply was not enough pavement left. The jet ran off the end of runway 09er, broke through the perimeter fence, dropped across a small road that lies in a shallow cut below runway level, and came to a stop in a rice field. As it hit the far embankment, the nose and landing gear were torn apart and fuel poured from the wings. A fire broke out almost immediately. Local television crews and bystanders filmed the wreckage burning in the field, with flames and thick black smoke rising from the broken fuselage. Many passengers managed to escape through doors and holes in the fuselage before the fire grew too intense. Others were trapped by heat, smoke, and jammed exits. Airport fire trucks reached the fence line but had trouble getting close to the airplane because of the ditch and slope between the runway and the rice field. Hoses were damaged by vehicles driving over them, and the fire burned fiercely for more than 2 hours before it was fully brought under control. Of the 140 people on board, 21 were killed, including one member of the cabin crew and a number of the Australian journalists seated toward the front. More than 100 others were injured, many with burns and broken bones, but 119 people survived. The pilots lived and were able to tell investigators what they remembered from the approach. The official investigation by the Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee found no major fault with the airplane itself. The weather was within normal limits, and both engines were working. The core problem was human, an unstable, high-speed approach that should have been abandoned, ignored warnings from the first officer and from the airplane's own systems, flaps set far too low for landing, and a failure by the first officer to take control when the captain did not respond. The report also noted that the runway at Yogyakarta did not meet international recommendations for a safety area beyond the end, which made the consequences of an overrun more severe. On July 24, 2024, Aerosucre Airlines CRJ-200 lined up on runway 02 at Tribhuvan International Airport in Nepal. On paper, it was a simple maintenance ferry to Pokhara for a heavy check, which should have meant only the 2 pilots on board. In reality, there were 19 people: the captain, the first officer, and 17 others, including senior managers from operations, maintenance, airworthiness, quality, and safety, plus engineers and at least one family. It was a private company flight, not a legal passenger service. Loading was just as casual. Airline staff packed the holds and cabin with tools, wheel chocks, spare parts, and cans of hydraulic fluid and other chemicals that the airline was not authorized to carry. Much of this cargo was simply placed on seats with no real restraint. Weights were guessed rather than measured. The dispatcher gave the first officer an estimated baggage figure to use for his calculations, and nobody checked it properly. For takeoff performance, the first officer used printed speed cards. He chose the card for the estimated weight, applied corrections, and read off the key speeds. The problem was the card itself. When Sauria had created its own tables, someone had copied the wrong numbers. The rotation speed on that card was about 4 knots lower than it should have been. That meant the airplane would be rotated before it really had enough speed for a safe liftoff. There was no flight attendant, no proper safety briefing, and only incomplete control checks, even though the jet had been parked outside for weeks. The captain did not cross-check the speeds. When they reported ready, the tower cleared them for takeoff, and the CRJ began its roll down the 3-kilometer runway. As the speed built, the first officer called V1 and then rotate. The captain pulled back sharply. Data later showed that his rotation rate was more than twice the recommended value, and because of the wrong card, he started that pull several knots too early. The combination of low speed and aggressive nose-up input drove the wing to a very high angle of attack. The jet lifted off, but only just above the ground, and the stick shaker immediately warned of an impending stall. Airport security cameras captured the next moments. The CRJ climbs only a few meters, rocks from right to left, and struggles to stay airborne with the nose high. Then the right wing finally loses lift. The airplane rolls hard to the right and pitches down with almost no height left to recover. As a T-tail design, the CRJ is vulnerable to a deep stall where disturbed airflow from the wings can partly blank the tail. The stick pusher, which is meant to push the nose down automatically, did activate, but at such low altitude there was nowhere to go. In the last seconds, the captain overrode the push and hauled back again, trying to clear the ground. He could not. The jet slammed into the edge of the airfield near buildings, broke apart, and burst into flames. Cell phone video from nearby shows a fireball and tall black smoke rising behind the airport. Rescue teams reached the site quickly, but the impact and fire were severe. 18 of the 19 people on board were killed. The only survivor was the captain in the left seat. When investigators downloaded the recorders and pulled flight data from other trips, they found that this was not an isolated event. Both Sauria CRJ-200s showed a long history of overly aggressive rotations, including earlier flights by the same captain with even higher nose-up rates. Nobody had intervened. Combined with the wrong speed tables, the unauthorized passengers, the unsafe flammable cargo, and skipped checks, it pointed to a deep cultural problem. Breaking rules had become normal. The official report concluded that excessive nose-up input and rotation below the correct speed put the jet into a deep stall seconds after liftoff. But the real story was an airline and an oversight system that allowed that situation to develop in the first place. On April 2, 2012, PenAir Flight 120 lined up for departure at Roshino International Airport in western Siberia. The airplane was an ATR-72 twin-engine turboprop heading north to Surgut with 39 passengers and 4 crew on board. Overnight, the weather in Tyumen had been classic spring Siberia, freezing temperatures, snow mixed with rain, and aircraft sitting outside collecting a thin but dangerous layer of ice. In the morning, the crew walked around the airplane and could already see some contamination. During taxi, when they switched the de-icing system into a special test mode, snow and ice deposits were again visible on the wings and tail. Under standard clean aircraft rules, that should have been the end of the discussion. Go back, get a full de-icing treatment, and only then take off. Instead, the captain and a mechanic convinced themselves the deposits were not serious and chose to continue without any ground de-icing at all. Flight 120 rolled down runway 21 and lifted off into light snow and low cloud. To everyone on board, it felt like a normal takeoff. The turboprops pulled the ATR into the climb, the flaps began to retract, and the airplane passed a few hundred feet above the ground. But ice on the wings and horizontal stabilizer was already changing the way the airplane flew. It reduced lift, altered airflow, and narrowed the margin before the wing would stall. As the flaps came up and the crew engaged the autopilot at about 600 feet, the first signs appeared. The ATR began to shudder and roll slightly, a kind of buffeting the pilots did not expect. The first officer said something was wrong. The captain asked, "What is this?" Seconds later, the airplane rolled right on its own. The pilots quickly switched off the autopilot and tried to correct with ailerons and rudder. They managed to stop the right roll, but the airplane then snapped left instead, the bank angle increasing as their inputs fought the aerodynamics of a wing on the edge of a stall. A stall warning sounded intermittently as the ATR began to lose height. In the cockpit, the stress level spiked. On the recorder, when the captain told the first officer to report their situation to the tower, the first officer shouted back, "Report what? What's the failure?" They were getting warnings and violent movements, but no clear indication of a single broken system. The engines were working normally. The real problem was simpler and more unforgiving. The airplane was too contaminated and too slow for the amount of lift it needed. Outside, an airport security camera picked up the ATR as it struggled away from the runway. The images show the turboprop at low altitude rolling from side to side, wings rocking as the pilots fight for control. In the final moments, the left wing drops to more than 50 degrees of bank, and the nose pitches down. An automatic stick pusher system, designed to push the nose down and break a stall, does activate, but the captain instinctively pulls back, trying to hold the airplane up. There is no altitude left to trade for recovery. 64 seconds after liftoff, Ethiopian Flight 120 slams into a snow-covered field about 1 nautical mile beyond the end of the runway, near the village of Gorkovka. The ATR breaks apart and burns in the snow. Of the 43 people on board, 33 are killed. 10 survive with serious injuries and are taken to hospitals in Tyumen. The investigation found both engines operating normally right up to impact. The core cause was the decision to take off with clear evidence of snow and ice still on the airplane, followed by a failure in the cockpit to recognize an approach to stall and use the correct recovery actions. Behind that were deeper issues: weak ground icing procedures, poor training on the dangers of even thin contamination, and a culture that allowed good enough decisions in bad weather. It was a textbook example of why modern winter flying is built around one simple rule: no ice on the airplane at takeoff ever. On September 7th, 2011, Aerosucre Flight 9633 lined up to depart Tunoshna Airport near Yaroslavl in western Russia. The airplane was a Yakovlev Yak-42, a 3-engine Russian jet. On board were 45 people, including almost the entire Lokomotiv Yaroslavl professional ice hockey team, their coaches, doctors, and staff heading to Minsk, Belarus, for the opening game of the new Continental Hockey League season. The weather was calm with good visibility and light winds. The jet entered runway 23 from a taxiway about 300 meters down, leaving around 2,700 meters of pavement. Flaps and slats were set correctly and the stabilizer trim was in range. When the tower cleared them for takeoff, the crew advanced the throttles and the yak began to roll. But acceleration was poor. The engine stayed at a reduced setting for several seconds before reaching full power, and even then the airplane did not pick up speed as expected. Later, investigators discovered why. One of the pilots had his feet placed incorrectly on the pedals and was pressing the toe brakes during the takeoff roll. That braking force pushed the nose down, so the pilot flying had to pull harder and harder on the control column to try to raise it. As he pulled, he braced with his legs, pressing the pedals even more. The harder he tried to rotate, the more the brakes held the airplane back. A black and white security camera on a mast near the runway end captured the last seconds. In the video, the Yak-42 races past the far threshold still on the ground, using all the pavement. Only after it runs off the end does it finally lift a few meters into the air, nose up but barely climbing. It never gets more than a couple of meters above the surface. Seconds later, the left wing clips the very mast that holds the camera. The picture cuts out as the impact destroys the antenna and the camera itself. After hitting the mast, the airplane yaws and rolls left. With part of the wing torn open, lift on that side collapses. The Yak shoots off toward the bank of the Tunoshanka River, close to where it joins the Volga. The tail section breaks off and ends up in the shallow water. The forward fuselage smashes into the riverbank and catches fire. Rescuers arrive quickly, but the crash forces and fire are devastating. Of the 45 people on board, 44 die. Almost the entire locomotive team, along with coaches and support staff, are lost. One player is pulled from the wreck alive but dies later in hospital. The only survivor is the flight mechanic, seated in the rear section. For the hockey world, it is a single event that wipes out a whole team on a day that was supposed to mark a new season. The Interstate Aviation Committee found no major technical failure. The engines were working, and the airplane was within or close to its weight limits. The real causes were human and organizational. One pilot applied brakes during the takeoff. The crew failed to notice the abnormal acceleration and did not reject the takeoff. Training and oversight at Yak service were poor. One pilot had falsified parts of his Yak-42 training record, and the co-pilot had a banned sedative in his system. Test flights later showed that with similar brake pressure, another Yak-42 behaved just like Flight 9633, slow acceleration, reluctant rotation, and a very late, shallow liftoff. To most viewers, Yak Service Flight 9.633 is a short, haunting clip of a team jet barely leaving the ground and vanishing in a burst of debris at the end of the frame. The investigation revealed something less dramatic, but more troubling. Years of weak training, bad habits, and poor supervision, all converging into those few seconds at the end of a Russian runway. On June 17, 2002, a Lockheed C-130 Hercules air tanker, call sign Tanker 130, lifted off from Minden Tahoe Airport in Nevada. The airplane was more than 40 years old, a former military transport converted into a firefighting tanker, now working for a contractor called Hawkins & Powers, under contract to the U.S. Forest Service. On board were 3 experienced crew members on a familiar mission: load about 3,000 gallons of fire retardant, fly a short hop to the fire, make the drop, and come home. That day they were fighting the cannon fire near the small town of Walker, in the mountains of Northern California. The fire was burning in steep, forested terrain, sending columns of smoke into a hot summer sky. Tanker 130 had already been to the fire several times. This would be its 6th drop of the day. The pattern was simple: leave Minden, climb over the ridges, check in with the air attack controller, descend into the valley, and run the tanker low and straight across the target line. On the ground, a tourist with a camcorder stood on a road with a clear view of the valley. When the big white and red Hercules appeared over the ridge, the tourist started recording, thinking they were about to capture a dramatic retardant drop in the middle of an active wildfire. Because of that one decision, the last seconds of Tanker 130 are now among the most shocking aviation clips ever filmed. The retardant run required the crew to fly across a ridgeline and then descend down a steep drainage low over the trees. On the video, the C-130 comes into view at the top of the ridge, wings level, flaps set, moving at moderate speed. It drops into the valley and lines up with the fire. At the call from the lead plane or at the right mark on their map, the crew open the drop doors. A red sheet of retardant falls away from the belly, spreading over the flames and the trees below. For a moment, everything looks normal. Then, as the airplane begins to climb away, the video shows something that should never happen. Both wings suddenly bend upward far beyond their normal flex, then tear away from the fuselage. There is a flash and a burst of debris. Freed of its wings, the fuselage rolls inverted and falls like a stone into the forest below, disappearing in a rising cloud of dust and smoke. The entire breakup takes less than 2 seconds. Everyone on board is killed instantly. The wreckage was scattered over a compact area near Walker. The wings came to rest close to the main fuselage, confirming that they separated almost in place rather than being thrown far away. Firefighters working the cannon fire rushed to the crash site, but there was nothing they could do for the crew. Later, they would be identified as Captain Steve Wass, First Officer Craig LeBaire, and Flight Engineer Mike Davis, all veterans of aerial firefighting. The video quickly became central to the investigation. For the accident board, this was a rare case where they could watch the structural failure as it happened. Frame by frame, they confirmed what witnesses had described. The right wing started to fold first, followed almost immediately by the left. That pointed straight at the center wing box, the part of the structure where the wings join the fuselage and which carries enormous loads every time the airplane pulls G, especially in low-altitude firefighting maneuvers. Investigators recovered the center wing sections and took them apart. Under the external doublers on the lower surface of the right wing, they found what they were looking for: fatigue cracks in the skin and underlying stringers near the wing-to-fuselage attach point. These cracks had started in rivet holes, slowly grown together over time, and eventually reached a length of around 30 centimeters. They had even propagated into the stringers beneath the skin. Because the cracks were under the doubler plate, they were almost invisible during routine external inspections. Over thousands of hours, as the tanker flew hard pull-ups and tight turns over fires, the cracks grew until the remaining metal could no longer carry the load. On that June afternoon, during the pull-up after the drop, the stressed center wing finally failed. Tanker 130's history helped explain how it got there. It had been built in the 1950s as a C-130A for the U.S. Air Force, retired from military service in the 1980s, then transferred to the Forest Service, and sold on to Hawkins & Powers for tanker conversion. Like many large air tankers of that era, it was an old airframe doing a new, very demanding job. Maintenance records showed inspections and repairs over the years, but the industry did not yet have a rigorous, type-specific program to find deep structural fatigue in these aging transports. Just a month after Tanker 130, another Hawkins and Powers tanker, a PB-4Y2 designated Tanker 123, suffered a similar wing failure over a fire in Colorado. 2 large air tankers, 2 catastrophic structural failures, and 5 crew members dead in one season, forced the authorities to confront the state of the entire fleet. The result was dramatic. The Forest Service and other agencies grounded the large tanker fleet, launched urgent structural inspections, and ultimately retired some of the oldest designs from frontline service. The accident board recommended much stricter maintenance and fatigue tracking programs for any heavy aircraft used in firefighting. In all of these stories, the camera only saw the last few seconds. A runway overrun in Alaska, a cargo jet tearing through a fence, an airliner forced into the ocean, a tanker losing its wings over a fire line, a small jet dropping into a neighborhood, a hockey team's airplane that never really managed to leave the ground. On video, they look sudden, almost random. One moment the airplane is flying, the next moment it is not. But when investigators went back through the wreckage, the recordings, and the paperwork, they kept finding the same patterns. Rushed decisions, missed warnings, broken procedures, maintenance problems that had been there for years, and safety cultures that had slowly stopped asking hard questions. The cameras did something useful. They showed the world how violent these last moments really are, and made it impossible to look away. That pressure helped push regulators and airlines to change training, redesign systems, improve runway safety areas, tighten winter operations, and take structural fatigue and performance planning more seriously. Today, passengers still see those old clips online and feel uneasy, yet the risk on a modern commercial flight is lower than it has ever been. Every one of these crashes left a rule, a checklist item, or a design change behind it, and those quiet changes are working for you every time your airplane takes off and lands without incident. For the families, teams, and communities that lost people in these accidents, none of that will ever be enough. Their lives stopped at the moment the camera cut off. The best anyone can do now is to keep telling these stories honestly, to remember the people on board, and to keep using what was learned so that the same chain of small errors does not come together again in a different cockpit. If you want more clear, careful aviation documentaries like this, it really helps if you subscribe, leave a like, and share the video with someone who would appreciate it. It tells the algorithm that there is an audience for slow, detailed explanations, and it lets me keep taking these short, shocking clips and turning them into complete stories about what really happened and why flying is still worth trusting.